Welcome to Eviliv, the live media commentary show that answers the question, are Cenobites angels or demons? I feel like my tongue is tied. Are Cenobites angels or demons? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing Clive Barker's Hellraiser. Oh my gosh, I love this film, and that is not the film at all. I just reviewed that one. All right, let's get this going right here. There we go. That's our boy. The priest, the Hell Priest. You call him Pinhead, you're a punk. That's just how it is. All right, so there are a few films that are so ingrained that I desperately love so much. They're actually a part of how I perceive reality, right? This is one of them. What Clive Barker did in the Hellbound Heart novella was awaken my sense of pain and pleasure, my desire to explore the further regions of experience. This concept that within hell or within greater outer dimensions, almost in a Lovecraftian sense, there are explorers like the Cenobites who are open to possibility and experience. And it's not always going to be in a positive way. Sometimes it's going to be in a terrifying way. But that's what experience is. And you don't really know those, really joyful highs unless you know those really painful lows. Compare and contrasting experience. So the idea of pleasurable sex mixed with pain goes hand in hand. You have to understand both, and that share in those both moments at the same time has got to be the greatest of all human experiences. Well, that's what Clive Barker is saying in The Hellbound Heart anyway, and I buy it. I think it's a great idea. It's a great concept. This is Clive Barker's directorial debut. He's had other stories turned into films. He didn't have a role in directing them, and they didn't really turn out that well. He just didn't enjoy, how they came on screen. And so he thought, I'm going to give it a go. And what he ended up doing was creating the best haunted house film, the best supernatural horror film, and it just ends up, sort of crossing genres in such a way that it is actually its own entity. The actual film itself almost entirely takes place within one single house, and yet it doesn't feel confined like that. And that's why I mean, like, this sort of haunted house. It's got this sort of Amityville horror vibe where, this darkness happens here. But it goes beyond just the house. So we're sort of opening on Hellraiser with this guy named Frank Cotton. And Frank, he's just trying to chase the dragon. He wants the best experiences and all experiences. And after he has sort of, had everything that he could possibly have in life, he seeks out esoteric expressions. He runs across this individual who gives him the puzzle box called the Lament Configuration. If you can unlock the secrets of this puzzle box, it will allow you to explore true pleasure on a sort of cosmic sense almost. And so, he's definitely game. He wants to try it. In the novel, it explains that he didn't know what these demons or these extra dimensional beings would like. And so he collected like feces and urine and mother's milk and blood. And like he was doing everything he can, sperm. Like he was trying to collect as much stuff so that they would enjoy themselves. In the film, it doesn't really show any of that, but that's okay because that stuff is gross anyway, visually. But it does have this really iconic scene of this square that he's sitting in, rimmed with candles. And he is kneeling naked on the floor and trying to unlock this puzzle box. And when he finally does, we get that stereo, which is now, that famous bell tolling, which is sort of the bells of hell or something like that. And then the light coming through the plaster framing of the walls, and then the walls sort of open up. We get chains jangling because that's sort of like the Cenobite thing. That's what they, that's how they roll. They have tons of chains, and chains will come out of the Lament Configuration sometimes. Sometimes chains come out, from that sort of extra dimensional hell world to strike people. But then it literally like rips Frank apart with all these different chains. And when, you're sort of faced with this idea of, well, Frank was chasing pleasure and pain. He found it in being ripped apart, but it's also the Cenobites who are seeking the enjoyment of pain and pleasure. And they're the ones who are the sadomasochists, really torturing those who are opening themselves, who want this experience. And in future Hellraiser films, it's listed in the second film. Pinhead, I just said it myself, I should be shot. The Hell Priest straight up says that it doesn't matter who opens the box, it's who wants the box opened. It's the person chasing the experience that they want to go after. And then, of course, in the remakes, they totally abandoned that whole really important point. And even in the sequels, they abandoned that really important point. But Clive Barker wasn't involved with any of those. So, as far as Clive Barker is concerned, outside of the Hellbound Heart and the Scarlet Gospels, which was written years and years later, Hellraiser 1 and 2 is the totality of the Hellraiser story. I mean, he went again and he did a lot of stuff with comics and explored the Hellraiser universe there, which I desperately love. And I actually really enjoy all of the films too, even the very last two films, which Doug Bradley wasn't playing Pinhead in. I just recently watched those again. They're not good, but the concept behind them is good. And that's what I really take away from all of these, sort of 80s horror films that visually aren't really as great as, you can do nowadays. But the story is great, and that's what's really important. So if you can look past production values, look past possible, bad acting roles, and just focus on the story, I think you'll enjoy some of these Hellraiser films a lot more. But if you are just focusing on the acting and, stuff like that, it's just not going to be very good. This is the budgetary issue, and that's reality, unfortunately. So, Frank ends up being trapped in hell with these Cenobites tormenting him, right? Then it's actually Larry and Julia. Julia is Larry's second wife, and they move into Larry's parents' house, and it turns out they find out that Frank has been squatting there, and that's actually where Frank was caught by the Cenobites. Julia is supposed to have been the main lead of all of the Hellraiser films, according to Clive Barker. But Claire Higgins doesn't like horror films at all. She couldn't even sit through the film after watching it. So she didn't want any part of it. She was in the second film, but she didn't watch it at all. And she didn't want to appear in any of the sequels either. Arguably, probably for the best, but she was supposed to be the main one. The problem is that, look, the Hell Priest, Doug Bradley looks too good as this Cenobite, and that is what captured audiences' attention. So he ended up becoming the lead rather than Claire as Julia. Even though Julia in Hellraiser 2 is amazing. We'll talk about that when I get there. So let's talk about the log line really quick here. A woman discovers the newly resurrected, partially formed body of her brother-in-law. She starts killing for him to revitalize his body so that he can escape the demonic beings that are pursuing him after he escaped their sadistic underworld. That's really the secondary setup. So for me, what's most important is this concept of Cenobites and the lament configuration. I think that's brilliant. The second part of that is the human experience interacting with those great concepts, and how we are so fragile as mortals that we're sort of at the mercy of everything out there. Again, this plays into a lot of Lovecraftian ideas, but when Clive Barker brings into it is a lot of sexuality, a lot of masochism and sadism, and it's just, there's something about Clive Barker's vision that is brilliant, truly, truly brilliant. So the leader of the Cenobites, of course, is portrayed by Doug Bradley. Barker originally wanted the electronic music group Coil to perform the music for the film, but insisted on insistence from producers, the film was rescored by Christopher Young. And I have to say, this is one of those scores like The Exorcist, where if you hear a few notes, you immediately know that's Hellraiser. That's how good of a job Christopher Young did with this film. It was just amazing. So Claire Higgins is Julia Cotton. Ashley Lawrence is Kirsty Cotton. Kirsty shows up in the sequel, and she also appears, I think it's like in the fifth one. But she doesn't play a large role. She's just present. She's a hook for other actors. Andrew Robinson is Larry. He's great as Larry Cotton. Sean Chapman is Frank Cotton, Larry's brother, who gets captured by the Cenobites. And then we'll get into the other people here in just a minute. So ultimately, Larry cuts himself when they're moving in. He goes up to Julia, who is sort of reminiscing about her affair with Frank on their wedding night. Like they were going to get married. Maybe it wasn't the wedding night. It was like right before the wedding with Larry. But Julia meets Frank, and then they have sex, and then Julia professes her undying devotion and love to Frank, but Frank's over it because he's had every other experience. He doesn't want another girl like Julia. She's like, I'll do anything for you, anything. And he's like, are you sure? And so now when Larry comes up with the blood hits the ground, and it starts to become this sort of gateway opportunity for Frank to come back and escape hell. And that's exactly what happens. He comes up, he's sort of reformed, and the special effects, the practical effects on this creation were just beautiful. If you've never seen Hellraiser before, you've got to, just for the effects alone, it's worth it. But the story is great too. So definitely check it out. Do yourself a favor. But, it sort of reforms into this body played by Oliver Smith as the skinless Frank, or Frank the Monster. And he's begging Julia to help him. Blood brought him back. He needs more blood to get his nerves back, to his organs to be redeveloped. And then ultimately he's going to need enough blood to make his own skin. Never gets to that point. But Julia is sort of at that point where she doesn't really like Larry, but they're married. And so she agrees to start bringing men up to the attic, like from bars and stuff, and then killing them so that Frank can then drain them of their body fluids. And then that will help him reform his own nervous system and tissues and tendons and muscles and stuff into, becoming a creature. So throughout the whole course of this film, we're seeing different versions of regrowth of Frank. And it's just great practical effects. And you see this twisting of Julia from a sort of passive-aggressive mother-in-law figure into a monster herself in her own right. Like she turns into this person who doesn't even mind violence. She doesn't mind the sight of blood or gore. She's willing to murder on behalf of the lover that she is developing up in the attic. So then let's talk about Christy a little bit, because Christy is Larry's daughter from his first marriage. Kirsty is played by Ashley Lawrence, great character, and she's the real heroine of the film. She comes in, realizes Julia is acting strange. There's something off about her. She's trying to reconnect with Julia for her father's sake. Then she sort of stumbles upon Frank. And Frank realizes who Kirsty is, and he actually kind of wants her, sexually. He sees her as a grown woman now, and so he's like, he always says stuff like, come to daddy, which is very kind of creepy, but it's that phrase that clues Kirsty in later in the film. So she learns that Frank wants this puzzle box because she's trying to get away from him when she gets cornered in that attic space with Frank. She grabs the puzzle box to hit him with it, and he freaks out. He's like, no, don't throw it. Leave it. Give it back to me. He really wants it. She's like, you want it? Here. And she throws it out the window. Then she runs out as he's going to the window to like sort of shout, no, trying to get the puzzle box. She goes outside, picks it up. And we sort of go through this whole exploration of what the puzzle box is. Kirsty accidentally opens it. The Cenobites come out to get her. She tells them about Frank and says, look, I'll lead you to Frank. He'll admit who he is, and then you can take him back. And they say, well, if you can actually do that, then, maybe we'll consider it, but they make no promises. And the only Cenobites that we see are the lead Cenobite, the Hell Priest, played by Doug Bradley. We see Chatterbox, which is the chattering Cenobite, played by Nicholas Vince. We see Butterball, which is the sort of chunky, fat Cenobite, played by Simon Bamford. And we see the female Cenobite, played by Grace Kirby. And they all have, fan-based names, but they never really gave them names in the novella, nor in the future subsequent Scarlet Gospels novel. There was also, some story bits that Clive Barker had noted down that was created into another novella called The Toll, sort of put together by, I don't know if it's a producing partner or some sort of weird relationship like that, but it's on Kindle and you can read it and it's fun. It's fine. It just reminds me of the comics is all, but it's supposed to be the bridge between A Hellbound Heart and Scarlet Gospels on the literary side of things for this franchise. But, Kirsty ends up tricking Frank into admitting that, because ultimately what happens is Frank needs skin and Julia doesn't care about her husband Larry anymore, and so they literally skin Larry, and Frank is wearing Larry's skin looking like him. And so the Cenobites come in and Julia tricks Frank into admitting who he is, and the Cenobites reclaim him. And then we get to see this great moment, which was ad-libbed and not in the script, where Andrew Robinson is sitting there chained up, his skin is pulled with hooks and chains, and he looks up at Kirsty and he says, "Jesus wept," and starts laughing as he's licking his lips. It's an amazing scene, and it just goes to show, look, when Jesus was on the cross, he was crying when he was in so much pain. I enjoy being ripped apart. And then, of course, he gets, ripped apart again. But the Cenobites still want Kirsty. Why wouldn't they? She's great, right? And so, one by one, she's like putting the Lament configuration back together in its original form. And that banishes one Cenobite after the other in this very sort of like haunted house escape scene vibe. And it's a lot of fun to watch. It's moderately scary. Maybe if you're younger, you'd be scared. But for me, I'm more interested than I am terrified. Visually, you can't get better than the Cenobites. They're just beautiful to look at. Grotesque, but beautiful. The story is about human experience and our desire to push the boundaries of experience. I can connect with that on a very intimate level. The idea that there are other entities out in the universe that are beyond our human experience. Yeah, I dig that idea. I don't believe it, but I still really enjoy that idea. It feeds into that idea of hell and demons and stuff like that. And Clive Barker's universes are just amazing. Just amazing, because it blends sexuality with gore and violence, and I love it. I absolutely adore it. This is a perfect horror film. I have zero complaints. On all these reviews, I try to give you my initial thoughts, my favorite parts, and my least favorite parts. I do not have a least favorite part of this film. Oh, no, I just thought of one. Oh, how terrible. I do. It's the engineer. So the idea is that the engineer actually created all the Cenobites in the film, right? And when we see the engineer, he's sort of moving forward towards Kirsty through the labyrinth of hell. And it looks kind of like a slug worm thing, with like a scorpion tail. They could never really get the practical effects right. And when it's chasing her, you can see the cart that's pushing the engineer toward Kirsty. And it's just really hokey. And arguably, it's the worst part about it. There's some special effects scenes that were done in like 1980s circa, sort of style, which is very poltergeisty, visual effects, or like Raiders of the Lost Ark visual effects. I personally grew up in that era, so I don't mind them. I enjoy them. I can see how a modern sensibility would look at that and go like, it's kind of shitty. Okay, fair enough. But that would be my least favorite, is the engineer. Outside of the engineer, everything else is a fucking hard home run hit. Every single damn part of this, from the acting to the story to the lighting to the set designs, everything is brilliant. The costume design, sweet hell, is beautiful. Yeah, if you haven't seen this film, or you haven't seen it in a while, do yourself a favor and check them out. So let's talk about the Cenobites just briefly, really quick here. They're extra-dimensional beings who appear in the novella The Hellbound Heart, the sequels of Scarlet Gospel and Hellraiser the Toll, and the 11 Hellraiser films. They're a religious sect in hell known as the Order of the Gash, describing themselves as explorers in the further regions of experience and granting sadomasochistic pleasures to those who call upon them. The idea of that, I just love it so much. So Clive Barker noted that he had a slight problem with the eroticism. He shot a much hotter flashback sequence than they would allow him to keep in. His was more explicit and less violent. the studio wanted to substitute one kind of undertow for the other. So Clive Barker had a much more explicit sexual encounter between Frank and Julia, but the studio said no. So let's take out the sodomy and put in the flick knife. So, like Frank, puts out his little switchblade knife and cuts the sort of halter top or whatever it is off of Julia's shoulder. That was the violent, scary moment that the studio had him keep in, and then took out all the sodomy, which, how dare you? What's wrong with a little sodomy between lovers? Oh, man. So the film was originally supposed to be called The Hellbound Heart after the novella. The studio decided the title sounded too much like a romance and asked Clive Barker to change it. But that's the point. That's the point. Anyway, Barker offered Sadomasochists from Beyond the Grave as the alternative title, which was wholesale rejected by everyone. One of the 60-year-old female crew members offered up What a Woman Will Do for a Good Fuck as the title. Which, I mean, if you're not getting it done right, you'll do anything to get it done right, right? A good fuck's worth murdering for, I guess. My favorite part of this film is, of course, the Cenobites. How could it not be? They are a standout. They're beautiful. They're horrific. The lore behind them is engaging and exciting. I love it. This film and the novella, The Hellbound Heart, are intertwined with the essence of my being. Everything about it. And so I cannot fault this. I have to give this, of course, 5 out of 5 evil eyes. This is a beautiful film that if you haven't seen it in a while, go back, revisit it. It will be the best time that you've had all day. I promise you. Unless you're like, helping rescue someone else from hell and murdering people and having wonderful Cenobite sex. Then it's not that good. But it's a close second. So check it out. Do yourselves a favor. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this review of Hellraiser by Clive Barker. Let me know what you thought of this film. Did it hold up to the Hellbound Heart novella? I'd love to hear from you. And as always, remember the evil spelled backward is live. So get out there and be evil. Just don't open a box while you're being evil. Bad things will happen to you.